Hello, everybody. This is Trevor Cully, host of the History of Persia podcast. From about 550 to 330 BC, most of the Middle East was ruled by the Achaemenid Persians. The Achaemenids pioneered the concept of a truly multinational empire that incorporated people from as far away as India and Greece under the banner of one empire for over 200 years. The story of Persia discusses the fall of ancient civilizations, the origins of endurance racing, 300 Spartans, the March of the 10,000, and at least one evil priest who replaced and impersonated the king, all before the Achaemenids came to a dramatic close with the story of being on the losing end of Alexander the Great's conquests. If that story and the cultures that surround it sound interesting to you, check out the History of Persia at historyofpersiapodcast.wordpress.com or wherever you find your favorite podcasts, like this one.
Before we get started, I'd like to offer a hearty congratulations to Bart van Loo for being made a commander of Belgium's Order of the Crown. Bart van Loo's book, The Burgundians, is a fantastic look at Valois Burgundy and its legacy. It's filled with interesting facts and compelling storytelling, and I've drawn from it a few times for this podcast. If you like this show, I'm sure you'll love The Burgundians. Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 5, The 100 Years' War. Today we finally are going to dive into one of the conflicts that defines Burgundian history, the 100 Years' War. Now, we have touched on the 100 Years' War in the past 2 episodes already, and from our episode on Flanders last time, we saw that the 100 Years' War was not without historical precedent. Really, the 100 Years' War can be thought of as a handful of separate wars that all got lumped together by historians. The tension between the English and French thrones did not start in 1337, but rather in 1066, when the Norman Duke William the Conqueror became King of England as well. From then on, the English kings were technically vassals to the French kings, and some of the largest and most powerful landowners in France. The rivalry between the two crowns really got going in 1152, when the Duke of Normandy, Henry Plantagenet, married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the ex-wife of the French king Louis VII, and one of the most powerful nobles of France in her own right. Henry also ruled the French counties of Anjou and Maine, and soon after his marriage became King of England. Henry did not stop there, and when he couldn't gain land via inheritance, he turned to warfare. Granted, sometimes he started with warfare too, as his succession to the throne of England came as part of a peace settlement in a war against the current king. Henry was able to gain control of the Duchy of Brittany and peel lands away from the southern county of Toulouse with force of arms. All of these gains led the King of England to become the preeminent landholder in France. In fact, the lands of the royal domain of France were dwarfed by those controlled by the kings of England. And if you divide the kingdom of France into lordships that pay homage to the kings of England and those that pay homage to the kings of France, you'd see that more than half of the area of France paid homage to the kings of England. A big reason for this divide is that it's hard to overstate the sheer size of Aquitaine at the time. To put its size in context, the duchy that we've spent the most time with so far was Burgundy, which in its own right was one of the larger components of France. Aquitaine, with all its dependent territories at the time of Eleanor and Henry's marriage, was over 6 times the size of Burgundy. Even without the Norman and Breton additions, the Dukes of Aquitaine were by their own right the largest landowners in France, and their duchy found its roots in the late antique and early medieval kingdom of Aquitaine. The Dukes of Aquitaine built up their holdings outside the duchy by adding the southern duchy of Gascony to their holdings. All of this combined to give Aquitaine a fierce tradition of independence from the French crown. In an attempt to co-opt the power of Aquitaine, King Louis VI married his son, the future Louis VII, to Eleanor, the young heiress of Aquitaine. However, as I mentioned previously, the match between Louis and Eleanor did not last, and after their divorce, Eleanor, now in her own right the Duchess of Aquitaine, decided to marry the younger and on the rise Henry. So in Aquitaine, Normandy, and Brittany, again, all large fiefs with strong notions of independence, were united under the ruler of a foreign kingdom, the kings of France saw half of their kingdom slipping away. The big issue was that although it was acceptable for a king to demand homage from a count or a duke, when that count or duke was also a king in his own right, the subservience in the feudal hierarchy got more complicated. Not only would a king that's also a count or duke have more resources to draw from than the average noble, but the dignity of the royal office made it almost embarrassing to pay homage to another king, even for territory outside that first king's kingdom. Therefore, the kings of England would always be trying to avoid paying homage for their French possessions and increase their autonomy on the continent. And conversely, from 1152 onwards, the preeminent policy of the French crown was to contain and dismantle the Angevin Empire, as these lands are now called by historians. Under Henry's sons, Richard the Lionheart and John, most well known for their roles in the legends of Robin Hood, the French kings were able to turn the tide against the English crown. Richard was, despite his reputation as a gallant knight and one of the heroes of the Robin Hood tales, a bad king who viewed his kingdom more as a financial engine to support his crusades and conquests than a responsibility. John was at least interested in ruling the kingdom, but was too weak a monarch to not have everything blow up in his face. Philip Augustus, or Philip II of France, was able to exploit the brothers' rivalry with each other and with their father to instigate many rebellions over the course of all three of their reigns. Henry II had 4 sons in total, and Philip was able to, at one point or another, get them all to rebel against their father. Upon Henry's death, Richard and John were the only sons left, so Philip broke off his friendship with Richard and exploited his friendship with John to get John to revolt. And then, when Richard died in battle, Philip broke off his friendship with John and continued his practice of trying to strip land away from the English kings. Philip was largely successful in this endeavor, and a frustrated John looked for allies to help him take back his continental possessions. The conflict between John and Philip culminated in 1214 with the Battle of Bouvines. This battle saw Philip utterly trounce John and Otto, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, and its aftermath saw Philip secure control over much of France and pushed the holdings of the kings of England south of the Loire River. John's domestic power and authority were significantly weakened by this battle, and his later signing of the Magna Carta is directly tied to his loss at Bouvines. Philip took the opportunity that John's struggles presented to send his son to England in an attempt to seize the English crown. This was justified through some creative interpretation of inheritance rights, a staple of Anglo-French conflicts. While Louis was eventually driven out of England, fighting on the continent continued, and more French territory was taken away from John. While John was having no picnic after Bouvines, his ally Otto fared even worse, and completely lost control of the German Empire in the battle's aftermath. Philip Augustus had, over the course of his reign, dismantled the Angevin Empire and simultaneously increased the power of the French crown, as many of the former Angevin counties were annexed into the royal domain. While the English kings still had holdings on the continent after Bouvines, they were no longer the existential threat to royal power that they were under Henry. Of course, this was not the end of the fighting. The English kings wanted to regain their lost territory, and the French kings wanted the Plantagenets out of France completely. Philip Augustus, his son Louis the Lion, and his grandson Saint Louis would continue to put pressure on the English until they were pushed back to the parts of the duchies of Aquitaine and Gascony around Bordeaux and the Garonne River. From here on out, this region is generally known as Guienne, but is also often still called Gascony. So now let's skip ahead in time just a little bit to Philip IV. As you'll recall from last episode, Philip provoked a war with the English king Edward I in an attempt to increase his power and holdings in France. Both sides had their victories and losses, but towards the end of the conflict the momentum was with the French. More importantly than that, the English barons got tired of supporting a costly war that really only benefited the king. The peace treaty more or less returned things to the status quo, with Edward keeping control of Guienne and paying homage to Philip for it. However, this treaty would have far-reaching implications, as a diplomatic marriage was arranged between Edward's son, also named Edward, and Philip's daughter Isabella. So while the peace would mark an end to the First 100 Years' War, as the Capetian-Plantagenet rivalry is sometimes known, it set the stage for the second. To get into why this marriage mattered, we have to trace the line of kings that follow Philip IV. Philip was succeeded by his first son, Louis X. However, he only ruled for about a year before dying, and left a daughter and a pregnant wife. His wife ended up giving birth to a son not long after his death, but that son would die in infancy. So broke the line of father-to-son successions that traced back to Hugh Capet and Robert II. A brief succession crisis between Louis's daughter Joan and his brother Philip followed. Philip was able to win out by citing Salic law, which stated that the French crown could not be passed to a woman. I feel like I should also note that Joan was a niece of Duke Odo IV of Burgundy, and in order to win over a powerful vassal with suspect sympathies, Philip married his own daughter, also confusingly enough named Joan, to Odo. I'm going to dive deeper into the family tree of the later royal Capetians and Burgundian Capetians a bit next time, as it conveniently touches on many of the places that the Valois Dukes of Burgundy would eventually inherit. But I will warn you that it's fairly confusing, especially as all the women seem to be either named Joan or Margaret. That aside, back to the succession. Philip may have used patriarchal Salic law to his benefit while claiming the crown of France, but it did him no good when he died, as he only had daughters, so upon his death, the crown went to another of his brothers, Charles. Under Philip V and his brother Charles IV, tensions with England were rising again. By now, Edward II, their brother-in-law, was King of England, and he had continually refused to pay homage for his holdings in Guienne. Under Louis X, he had gotten away with it, but Philip V decided to press the issue. After much cajoling and saber-rattling, he convinced Edward to pay homage for Guienne, but when Philip decided to go a step further and get Edward to swear an oath of fealty to him, Edward refused. The difference between homage and fealty is one of those things that doesn't exactly translate to today, but the gist of it is that homage was limited to Edward's role in Guienne, while the oath of fealty would put Edward as a person below the feudal hierarchy to Philip as a person. When Charles came to the throne, Edward attempted to avoid paying homage to him as well. Things came to a head when local spats between lords loyal to the English and French kings erupted, and Charles took advantage of Edward's reluctance to do anything about it by invading. Charles sent his uncle, Charles of Valois, to invade Guienne, and he was entirely successful. Valois caught the English unprepared and pushed them back to the Atlantic coast, gaining control of almost the whole of Guienne in less than 2 months. In the aftermath of his military disaster, Edward sent his wife and Charles's sister, Isabella, to negotiate a settlement. The peace treaty returned a diminished Guienne to Edward if he would personally travel to Paris to pay homage for it. Edward decided to hand Guienne to his son, also named Edward, in order to keep Guienne in the family but not have to pay homage to Philip personally. Unfortunately, sending his son to France really backfired for Edward, but to see why, we'll have to take a quick look at the political situation in England. While English fortunes were in retreat on the continent, in Britain they were on the rise. During the reign of King Edward I, the English king held overlordship, if not direct control, over Scotland and was steadily encroaching on Wales. This encroachment was led by a group known as the Marcher Barons, lords that held land on the English border with Wales, and were tasked with defending the frontiers. The Marcher Barons decided to go on the offensive, and over the course of 20 years or so, conquered Wales. Now, under Edward II, the success of the Marcher Barons would go to their heads, and without the prospect of Welsh conquest to distract them, they would set their sights on English high politics. The Marcher lords had long been rivals of the Despencer family, royal favorites under the first 2 Edwards. Due to royal favoritism, deft politicking, and a dynastic marriage, the Despensers had gained control over much of the Marcher territories. This inheritance angered many of the Marcher barons, especially Lord Roger Mortimer, and they decided to rebel in order to gain control over the March lands controlled by the Despensers, but also to generally remove the family from power and expand the power of the barons of England at the expense of the king. Unfortunately for Mortimer and his accomplices, this rebellion failed, and they fled to France. It is in France, some years later, that Queen Isabella would fall in with Mortimer. While during the Despencer War, Isabella was a staunch ally of her husband. In the years following the conflict, the two seemed to drift apart. Isabella herself was never a great friend of the Despensers, and the failure of the Despensers to remain in control of Scotland when it revolted alongside the Marcher barons seems to have deepened her disdain for the family, and, by extension, drove a rift between her and her husband. Political conflicts between the Queen and the Despensers would continue, with the Despensers routinely gaining the upper hand and disenfranchising the Queen and her allies. Some even speculate that Isabella volunteered to go to France for the negotiations to get away from her husband and his favorites. So when Isabella got to the continent, she linked up with Mortimer, both politically and romantically, and the two began plotting to overthrow Edward. And when the boy Edward followed his mother to France to pay homage for Guienne, Isabella saw her opportunity. She was able to secure a loan from her brother, the King of France, and married the boy Edward to the daughter of the Count of Hanau, Holland-Zealand, for his support. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England and exploited the wide hatred of the Despensers to quickly gain momentum. After a short civil war, the Despensers were all either exiled or executed, and Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. The next few years saw Isabella and Mortimer in control of England, and during this time, Charles IV died without an heir. Technically, as the king's nephew, Edward III had the best claim to the throne. However, much of the French nobility had no desire to be ruled by the King of England or by his mother, and so using that old excuse of Salic law, argued that as Edward was related to the Capetians through his mother, his claim to the throne was invalid. Instead, the nobles chose Philip of Valois, the son of the Charles of Valois who had conquered Guienne and grandson of King Philip III. Although unhappy about it, Isabella and Edward III initially accepted the outcome and paid homage to Philip of Valois, now Philip VI, for Guienne. However, as Edward began to grow up, he grew increasingly frustrated with his mother and Mortimer's control over him. Edward was able to find others who were discontented with Mortimer, and in 1330 surprised, captured, and executed Mortimer, and began a long, in fact one of the longest in English history, period of personal rule. Over the next few years, Edward waged war against the Scots and strengthened his control of England, rebuilding much of the powers of the king that had lapsed during his father's rule and his own minority. During this period, tensions between England and France were rising yet again. The French were natural allies of the Scots, and during Edward's conflict with Scotland, he was forced to deal with the occasional French raids, as well as aid sent to Scotland from the French. Philip VI was also building a large fleet to go on crusade, but the fleet was stationed in the English Channel rather than the Mediterranean, raising fears of a possible French invasion. Edward decided to call for a peace summit with Philip to try and reduce the tensions. After all, he had a war with Scotland to wage. But Philip refused the invite, further increasing tensions. In 1337, Philip seized Guienne over a political dispute between him and Edward responded by renewing his claim to the French throne and preparing an invasion of the continent. The 100 Years' War had begun. Fortunately for the flow of our narrative, much of the early fighting took place in the north by Flanders, rather than in the south by Guienne. So now's a good opportunity to pick up in Flanders where we left it last time. We ended our last episode by mentioning how the threat of an English embargo of Flanders was enough for the Flemish to drive Louis of Navarre out of their country. The leader of this rebellion was a cloth merchant from Ghent named Jacob van Artevelde. Artevelde organized the three principal towns of Flanders, Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres, into a body known as the Three Members of Flanders. The Three Members was originally created to coordinate the activities of the cities, but the power of the three cities in the county, especially when they all worked together, made the three members act more like a Flemish parliament than anything else. Artevelde, in the wake of the flight of Louis of Navarre, was named Captain General of Flanders, a part martial, part political office that essentially gave him the powers of the count, but in an urban parliamentary framework rather than a feudal one. Von Artevelde and the three members were able to establish Flemish neutrality between England and France, and in exchange got the English to lift their embargo. Neutrality, however, did not last long. Realizing that no matter what, the revolutionary Flemish government was under threat from Louis and his ally the French king, and that the English trade was the lifeblood of the Flemish economy, the three members decided to formally join with the English and recognize Edward III as King of France. The Anglo-Flemish alliance was good for both parties for multiple reasons. First and foremost, it ensured that commerce between the two would continue uninterrupted, and as wars tend to be expensive, the trade and subsequent taxes were to be of great use to Edward. Additionally now, rather than being seen as rebels, the Flemish could be seen as supporting their king, even if not many other French subjects saw it that way. It should also be noted that the Flemish were not the only ones in the Low Countries supporting Edward. While their role is less important due to their smaller economic force and the fact that they were not technically a part of France, the Duchy of Brabant and the counties of Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland sided with England for similar economic reasons as Flanders. And so the first few years of the war saw the French gaining ground in Guienne and the English gaining ground in Flanders. In 1340, Philip planned to use his navy in the English Channel to go on the offensive. However, English ships attacked them at the port of Sluis in Flanders. This battle saw the French fleet essentially destroyed, and much like the later Battle of Trafalgar, saw the English gain dominance over the Channel. However, the next few years did not see much action. The reason for this lull in the fighting was because, as I mentioned earlier, war is expensive. Edward had almost financially ruined his kingdom, and had actually financially ruined many of his lenders to whom he defaulted. Philip, while he had many more resources to draw from than Edward, had a much harder time drawing on those resources. And so while France was not feeling the same financial burden that England was, it was still getting more and more difficult for Philip to raise funds. Of course, this was not a period of peace, and sporadic fighting continued on multiple fronts, including a proxy war in Brittany called the War of the Two Jeans, which is sadly out of the scope of our story. Fighting ramped up again in 1346 when Edward had time to secure some more money from Parliament, in exchange for a few concessions of course, and decided to invade Normandy. The campaign saw Edward march and plunder all across Normandy and get within spitting distance of Paris itself. Edward decided against trying to take Paris, and instead moved north towards Flanders. The Flemish had staged an invasion of France to go along with Edward's Norman campaign, and while they did not have the same success that Edward did, had managed to push the French back in a few places. However, after a few setbacks and some intercity bickering, the Flemish force dissolved. And so Edward found himself near the town of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, in a decent defensive position, but without reinforcements coming from Flanders or from England, and with a much larger French force on his tail. Edward decided that Crécy was as good a place as any to stage a last stand. He took up position on a hill and waited for the French to reach him. The battle began, with the English longbowmen and the French crossbowmen exchanging fire. The longbowmen proved themselves superior, and the crossbowmen began to retreat. As the French arbalists retreated, the knights began to charge. Unfortunately for the knights, the combination of mud on the ground, the weight of their armor, and the retreating crossbowmen made for a less than ideal charging environment. And if that wasn't enough, they were charging uphill into English longbow fire. Many knights fell on their way up the hill, and those that didn't lost much of their momentum during the climb. When the knights made it to this top, they were greeted by sturdy English men-at-arms and easily repulsed. The pattern of charge and retreat repeated time and time again, and each time the English suffered minimal losses. The French, however, were not so lucky. While the estimate of commoner French casualties varies greatly, we do know that several thousand definitely died, and the number is commonly posted over 10,000. We have firmer estimates on the losses of the nobility, with over 1,500 dead, including many of the highest rungs of French nobility, and most notably for us, Louis of Nevers, Count of Flanders. The battle was a disaster for the French and a boon to the English. The prestige of Philip was greatly diminished by this defeat, and simultaneously, Edward was able to use it to help justify the war, and more importantly, the increase in taxation, to Parliament. After Crécy, Edward was able to march to Calais and put it under siege for almost a year without having to worry about a French counterattack. Calais would remain in English hands for 200 years and would become home to the English staple, where all English wool would enter Europe. It also proved to be a useful staging point for other invasions of France throughout and after the 100 Years' War. Not long after Crécy, France was rocked by another, and a far deadlier crisis. The Black Death had arrived. Fortunately for the French, the plague did not target based on nationality, and the English were hit just as hard. The death caused by the plague so weakened the manpower of both sides that the next few years saw another break in the fighting. The final years of Philip VI's life were not happy ones. His defeats on the battlefield caused many in France to lose confidence in his ability as a military commander, and after Crécy, his requests to raise money for counterattacks were outright refused. In its first wave, the plague is estimated to have killed a third of the French population, and the manpower shortage was felt just as heavily in the economy as it was in the army. Inflation rose precipitously, and there was little Philip could do. If Philip's post-Crécy career has a silver lining, it would be his acquisition of Dauphiné. Originally known as the County of Alban, one of the counts of Alban was called Le Dauphin, or the Dolphin, due to the dolphin on his coat of arms. The name stuck, and eventually the title of Count of Alban was changed to Dauphin of Viennois. The last independent Dauphin had no heirs and had many debts, and so agreed to sell his county to the French crown. This sale had a few conditions, including that Dauphiné would be administered by the heir to the French throne, henceforth also known as the Dauphin, and that Dauphiné would keep much of its autonomy as well as exemptions from certain taxes. Interestingly enough, Dauphiné was technically a part of the German Empire at the time, and so the French acquisition of Dauphiné mirrors the English acquisitions of the Angevin Empire. In practice, however, the situation was not the same. The German monarchs were far weaker than the French at this point, and the relatively close proximity of France to Dauphiné made it much easier for the French to administer the province than it ever was for the Germans. So for now, Dauphiné was a quasi-independent French satellite state with distant, but still there, ties to the empire. And we will have much more to say about the province going forward, especially once we get to Louis XI. You can tell I really like Louis XI by how many times I've hinted at him on the show so far. The first French Dauphin was not Philip's heir John, but rather John's son Charles. Even if John had gained control of Dauphiné through the sale, he would not have had long to take it in, as not long after the transfer was made, Philip VI died. John did not come to the throne at a good time to be king, but his time as prince was no picnic either. John had cut his teeth in Normandy, and so had to deal with both rebellious lords who had just as many connections, if not more, to England as France, and Edward's campaign through Normandy. His reign was consequently one of the more turbulent ones in French history, and for almost a third of it, he wasn't even in the kingdom. But despite all that, he is known to history as John the Good, or, as I prefer the French here, Jean le Bon. However, before we get to that, we need to cover his conflicts with the lords of Normandy and his cousin, Charles the Bad, King of Navarre. So let's take a moment to introduce Charles. Charles the Bad is one of those characters that pops up from time to time that just seems to delight in causing trouble in order to profit from it. He was the son of the Joan that Philip V pushed aside, and thus was also the grandson of Louis X. After the death of King Charles IV and the end of the male Capetian line, Charles the Bad had his own claim to the throne, but was passed over due to Salic law just as Edward was. As Navarre had no obligations, real or fictitious, to Salic law, Joan was able to claim the crown of Navarre after her uncle died, and then pass it on to Charles. However, while he held the title of King of Navarre, his primary interests were generally tied to his large holdings in Normandy. As Navarre's northern border touched Gascony, and Charles was one of the major landholders in Normandy, his interests tend to intersect with both the English and the French, and both kingdoms were interested in having him as an ally. Consequently, Charles spent his first few years in power making and breaking alliances with both. This caused both parties to get extremely annoyed with him, but in general, they did not want to completely alienate such a useful potential ally. Early in John's reign, he had executed the Constable of France, a high office of the royal court that gave the holder a position just below that of the king, on suspicion of treason and passed the office along with the land holdings to a favorite of his. This move served to alienate many of the nobles in Normandy, as the former constable came from one of the great Norman families. These alienated nobles went looking for a new leader and found themselves following Charles the Bad. In the mid-1350s, Charles the Bad began to cultivate a friendship with the Dauphin, also named Charles. We can't say for certain if the rumors are true, but given everything I know about Charles's intrigues, I believe them. But it seems like Charles of Navarre and the Dauphin Charles were plotting a coup to overthrow and replace John. John attempted to pacify his son by making him Duke of Normandy, and still did not want to completely alienate the King of Navarre. But day by day, his patience with Charles grew shorter and shorter. Unfortunately for John, Charles's interests and power in Normandy made him a natural ally and counselor to the newly minted Duke of Normandy, and so he and the Dauphin continued to grow closer. After Charles the Bad organized an assassination of the new Constable of France, John had had enough. In 1356, he arrested Charles in the Dauphin's castle in Rouen. This arrest meant that Charles had no part to play in the upcoming Battle of Poitiers, but he would have a large part to play in the battle's aftermath. The arrest of Charles was the last major action that John took before Poitiers, and so we'll end this episode in 1356. France had been devastated by both war and plague, and their effects were being felt throughout the kingdom, even if they were not always uniformly felt. There was a manpower crisis in every sector of the economy, and consequently, all kinds of goods were becoming much harder to come by, causing inflation and scarcity. The power of the kings had been chipped away by military defeat and economic devastation. John, who had never been extremely popular in Normandy, even as Duke, had sparked a revolt with his arrest of Charles, and his support of bellicose pro-French Gascon lords in the south had provoked an English response. While the break in fighting had seen France devastated by the plague and racked by internal division, the English had begun to rebuild their strength. Of course, they were hit hard by disease as well, but their path to recovery seemed quicker than France's. On the northern front, the English had dealt with the Scots for the time being, so France could no longer use that distraction. And on the domestic front, while Edward's attempts to curb inflation were not perfect, they were miles better than John's attempts. Additionally, the financial position of the English crown was significantly stronger than that of the French. Edward was successfully cooperating with Parliament at this point in his reign, and in exchange was supplied with a willing tax base. John, on the other hand, had no such institution to agree to taxes with, and was forced to raise them on a case-by-case basis. As the French economy was much harder hit than the English, and as John's authority was slipping, he was having a hard time doing so, and in fact had defaulted on many of his debts. All of this contributed to Edward's decision to send his son, Edward the Black Prince, to Guienne. The Black Prince landed in 1355 and began to pillage through the neighboring pro-French territories, spreading devastation wherever he went. John knew that he was going to have to deal with the young Edward, but didn't want to move all his forces south and leave the, at this point not openly in revolt but simmering with tension, Duchy of Normandy open to invasion from England. Initially, he sent reinforcements to the Count of Armagnac, but felt he could not spare much else. Seeing an opportunity, Edward III sent an expedition to invade Normandy from Calais. John and his much larger force beat back the English, but failed to inflict serious damage to the invading army. After his victory in the north, John decided to finally do something about the swath of destruction the Black Prince was cutting. So in 1356, John headed to Gascony, where he was confident that he would drive the English out of France for good. He had rejected a peace treaty proposed in 1354, which would have given away much of southwest France to the English, and was now planning to take Guienne back. Sure, England had bounced back from the plague and war more than France had, but France was so much bigger and richer. John was on his way to meet his destiny, and nothing could go wrong. Right? Thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it 5 stars on your platform of choice and tell your friends about it. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me on twitter.com/Valois Burgundy or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. The podcast also has a website at granddukesofthewest.com. If you want to get in contact with me, you can email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com.